If there's one thing that I'm mostly regretful when it comes to Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends week, it's mainly the fact that the episode that I reviewed involving Mac Daddy, which is the first appearance involving Cheese, is that his other appearances afterwards is the least to be discussed about his character. And if I'm ever going to talk about all of Cheese's appearances in this show, it's gonna be a really difficult time for me to actually discuss of how his character actually works and what doesn't. And let me tell you, the Big Cheese is a big example of how his character isn't done properly. I'm just gonna point out, if some of you guys are mostly disappointed that I'm not revealing pranks for nothing for this month, I'm saving that video for next month's schedule, because I actually want to get this episode out of the way, mainly that after completely thinking about it and just recognizing how terrible this is, since that it's a Cheese fan service episode, I really need to get this out of the way. So there's not much of a change when it comes to schedules, it's just an episode swap between schedules. Frankie tells the other imaginary friends that a news podcast is gonna come over and do some interviews. And this is gonna be very important so that more people can actually see what Foster's really is, instead of just checking through their website, which they didn't advertise. Usually it's an episode that could have easily worked to discuss of what Foster's really is, but since this is called The Big Cheese, which I assume that it's a fan service episode title that they came up with for people who actually enjoy Cheese, this episode just goes down to a downward spiral, because we get a gag of Cheese just instantly coming over to Foster's, and while everyone says that he doesn't live here and he should go home, he doesn't listen. At all. Whatsoever. Now, compared to his first appearance, you can easily understand how he's feeling and his development is like, even if you like him or not, but here, he is just really doing this for the sake of just driving other characters to insanity, and the fact that he is not even good at listening to characters 100% clearly, unlike in his first appearance. Why do I say that? Well, after Frankie told him to leave, he instantly goes to other places, and the gag of everyone just keeps telling him to leave keeps going on and on and on. And at this point, it's not even funny. I don't even understand how any of this is considered hilarious, because Cheese just screams because there's trash on the floor in the arcade room, and then Mac does the same what Frankie does, and since that Eduardo didn't lock the door, Cheese just enters in and just use a carrot to stab Eduardo to do a killing reference or something. And the reference doesn't work because it's just phoned in with no justification. Look, just because Cheese has disorders that can easily have really painful abilities to handle that makes him a really incredible disability imaginary friend, doesn't mean that most of the jokes really work. Maybe it was when we were children and when we enjoyed this episode because we enjoyed Cheese, if there are some children who cannot stand Cheese. But looking at them now, they really don't even fit whatsoever in the situation involving the characters just being prepared to do some interviews. Not only that, when we completely see Wilt in this episode, they don't know what to do with Wilt in this episode whatsoever. Not even a bit. Let me tell you that they could do a lot with Wilt in this episode if the writing was much more better instead of just making a Cheese-focused episode. Tell me, if you really ask me, the second half of this episode and the plot to this episode really goes to show that they only have Wilt out of this episode to do some deliveries just for the sake of having this episode mainly focusing around Cheese. If anything, it makes me disappointed that the special involving Wilt that comes later in the series ends up becoming way more better on what you think that what he could have done, unlike what he did in this episode, is honestly really, really depressing. As far as I'm concerned, Wilt has to be one of the most underused characters I've ever seen when it comes to growing up with this show. Say all you want, but at the same time, Wilt is really tolerable in this show for my standards. So anyway, after he tells Cheese to leave again, Cheese comes back to Foster's again, and for some reason, he has no reasons onto why he keeps coming back to Foster's whatsoever. You can argue that in the first appearance of Cheese, he really doesn't know how to handle what it's like when it comes to living in Foster's, and when people meet him for the first time, they really don't know what to do with him other than just keeping him at Foster's in order to have him stay. But on the other hand, in this episode, learning that he's from one of Max's neighbors, it's really difficult to have him coming back to Foster's again and again, and it's really annoying on how he's causing a mess, which could lead to a very terrible impression from the broadcast people who's gonna come over. And this leads to the main plot to this episode, where Mr. Hellman decides to buy a security code outside of the building so that Cheese won't be able to get in unless if he figures out the code. And since that we're already several minutes in, this is where we get to the biggest issue with this episode. This is one of the only episodes where Mr. Hellman isn't really rude and aggressive and being very strict against Frankie or the other characters. However, he still has a disability and to understand what technology works, which does make sense on what he's trying to do in order to prevent Cheese to get into Foster's. But on the other hand, why couldn't he just have Frankie help him on the security system? If anything, it will probably save this episode's terrible moments, which we'll get to later, and it will probably make me appreciate of how this episode would have been if Cheese wasn't the main focus. And after yet another joke involving the other characters kicking Cheese out, seriously, how will the writers seriously think that this is hilarious to begin with? Usually running gags are mostly humorous if it's done right, but this is nowhere near the case where Cheese is just completely ignoring what everyone is saying to him about leaving Foster's. So anyway, Mr. Hellman reads the instructions and he decides to put the code at random for every single time. He doesn't set up a code for any of the residents for Foster's. He doesn't keep the code away from Cheese. He just sets the code to random, which will prevent Cheese from coming in. Yeah, this really goes to show that Mr. Hellman has his worst moments even when he's not strict. And let me tell you, when he had the idea of having everyone to come outside just to showcase the security system, it's obviously not a good sign. Especially that leads to many plot holes that we're going to witness in this episode. After showcasing the security system of itself, he types in the code again, but with a different code. And this is where the entire episode takes place. They're completely locked outside the house, and then when Mr. Hellman tells the code again, they learn that the other characters learn that he types in the code at random, and they're locked out of the house. And let me tell you that for the majority of this episode with the characters going outside because they can't get in, could have been an interesting idea, except that, again, this is a Cheese episode and by far one of the worst episodes to involve Cheese, unlike his first appearance. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. Everything that I've seen in this episode, even when I was a child, I can say for a fact that this episode instantly brainwashed a lot of people when it comes to what to enjoy from Cheese and what to not to enjoy from other characters. Granted, I don't usually respect people's opinions when it comes to people liking episodes like this, even though that they might have some insignificant reasons onto why they enjoy it, mainly Cheese. But if you look at this episode closely, way more than you did when you were a child who grew up with the show, this episode is really aged badly. So badly that it's just difficult to look at the past on what you see involving these characters. So anyway, they actually figure out that Cheese actually knows the code. Well, from Frankie. You know, it's one thing to get inside the building in some other way, but on the other hand, Mr. Helmet made the security system for the sake of keeping Bendy out, for keeping Cheese out. And then if anything, shouldn't they at least thank Mr. Helmet to actually invent a security system and not give the idea to have Cheese be the one to speak out what the code is? We all know that the code is going to go up random, so it's just difficult for Cheese to actually figure out what code it is and what is not. And let me tell you, whenever the time that they actually get the code out of them, and if they actually type in the code entirely and perfectly without the interference of Cheese, I can guarantee you that they're still going to be locked out regardless. Let me tell you, we don't even get any information of the amount of codes that are at random. Not 2 or 5 or how many, just no explanation. And then when we completely see that they're trying to get the code out of Cheese, this just really just delays the episode just for the sake of making it 22 minutes. I'm serious. This episode really makes this entire dedication to Cheese really more obvious than just seeing what it was in the past. So when Frankie Neals tried to get the code out of Cheese, he instantly freaks out because of some insignificant word that he doesn't like or a letter, and then when the other characters try to help, he just keeps screaming and screaming, and it's not hilarious. Like, how is any of this humorous to begin with? It just isn't. If anything, I'm honestly disappointed that these characters didn't go to the back and then actually open any of the basement doors or whatever to get into the Fosters into a different way. In the episode where Blue and Mac get lost in Fosters from the first season, it was for the top roof of the building, and I highly doubt that there's gonna be a lock, because even though that there could be intruders, they might be able to keep the door locked during the nighttime and not in the daylight. So I'm honestly having that difficult of a time to actually think that they're gonna be spending most of the episode getting the code out of Cheese, only to get a big backfiring from Cheese later on. And let's get into Blue. For the majority of this episode, Blue is completely bored. Like, completely bored. And this is one of the only episodes where his finalization is at his highest, but at the same time, he doesn't do much in this episode, except that he's just wanted to cause chaos. And I'm being serious. I'm saying this because when he tries to cool down Cheese, he actually managed to succeed, but unfortunately, he actually enjoys Cheese freaking out. This is the same character who want to get with Cheese from the first episode of Cheese's appearance. And you're telling me that after so many episode appearances, he can actually tolerate with him? Yes, I understand that I did talk about his realization at the end of Cheese's first appearance in Mac Daddy, but on the other hand, if you really ask me, watching the other episodes afterwards, it's difficult to actually look at Blue and his perspective on Cheese afterwards. It really makes no sense to actually see Blue enjoying this. If anything, it just makes him even more unredeemable, than the fact that he doesn't do much in this episode other than just causing more issues with the other characters. And to make things even more frustrating, when Frankie tries to calm down Cheese just instantly doesn't know what to respond for what Frankie is just trying to get the answer from, because he just pukes out on Frankie's clothing, and then when Frankie gets information or a call from the news broadcast, they're completely doomed, and they don't have any other way to get inside Foster's, even though that it's mainly the fact that they didn't even try to go around the building in the first place, or around. And like I said, Wilt keeps going to do some deliveries because Frankie keeps giving him money to buy some stuff, and it just leads to nowhere whatsoever. But then again, the worst has yet to come, and we only have 9 minutes of this episode left. Since Frankie refuses to give up and tries to get the code from Cheese, he decides to play a game where he fools everyone, including Cheese, well, except Mac, in order to get him to say the code. He uses rocks, which isn't candy whatsoever, and the fact that whenever she tries to take a step further, Cheese just pushes her back. Seriously, I'm being a lot more serious. Cheese is honestly uncooperative whenever Frankie tries to do something in order to get the code out of him, and the fact that Cheese just instantly freaks out, it's just difficult to actually see him as the main focus in this episode, since that he's the one who caused most of this stuff to happen. If anything, it really gives the writers who try to write Cheese in an autism way is given a bad example to disability people who has autism. And for me personally, I have autism, and just watching this episode, it's just really, really uncomfortable to actually look at the moments of Cheese just ignoring the other characters and just causing more stress. Especially when he throws a rock at Frankie after realizing that the rock isn't candy. Usually I don't blame Frankie, but on the other hand, it's getting really done to death to see her very frustrated. Yes, I understand that she completely plans everything when it comes to the interviews and stuff, but just look at her in this episode, it's just really getting irritating to the point of seeing her getting frustrated. Yes, this show has different kinds of emotions that they put in order to have some kind of originality in this show, but on the other hand, looking at Frankie completely enraged, all because of so many things not going her way, is getting done to death, even after rewatching the series for preparation for reviews. So anyway, Goo appears, and this is literally one of the only reasons onto why I enjoyed this episode, is the fact that we get to see interactions from Cheese and Goo, but then I realize that internal slumber, if I did spell that episode title right, came out before this, and that was actually the first time where Goo and Cheese meet. So I honestly think that this episode isn't any much more better after I figure out that information. So anyway, Goo actually figured out a solution by doing some charades in front of Cheese in order to say the codes. And this just leads to another joke involving Frankie just taking Wilt to a different location to buy something. Seriously, what is the point with these subplots not going very well for the sake of having the characters like Wilt not contributing anything to the main plot? It's honestly really annoying if you ask me. So anyway, we see that Cheese mimics everything of what Cheese is doing, and after figuring out what to do in order to get the code out, Cheese mimics everything of what Goo does, and he says the boop sound, which is something that he's been doing for the majority of this episode. And he tells Mac to press in the codes, which for some reason understands the code from Cheese. Look, I understand its randomness when it comes to the system code, but on the other hand, even if Mac knows Cheese a little personally, since that they're neighbors, it doesn't make any sense that he will understand the code at random, because again, we don't know for sure if the code that the characters type in is gonna be correct when it comes to unlocking the front door. So this leads to the other characters completely mimicking all of what Cheese does, and I would say that this is supposed to be humorous, but just by watching this, it's not really humorous or cute. This doesn't usually work at the fact that Cheese is honestly going to do something very terrible at the end, which leads to pretty much one of the worst endings from any other cartoon I've seen. Well, from this show at least. Granted, this isn't nowhere near as bad as the Imposters episode, or Everyone Knows It's Bendy, or any of the episodes I've talked about in the past, but it's still up there. And believe me, when the other characters tried to mimic everything, Cheese had this mindset to completely go into the mud, and everyone just ends up doing it. And if this is supposed to be the comedy in this episode, it fails because of what Cheese does next is that after doing the mud, he completely throws a rock at Foster's, the windows. And if you completely remember correctly, most of the imaginary friends are small enough to go through any of the broken buildings inside of the house. It makes no sense onto why they couldn't just go into the building, even if it could be questionable when it comes to the nuke of the broadcast people to get in. So I honestly found it difficult to believe that Frankie and the Yellows would easily accept this and just think that Cheese will make everything better, except that he does the opposite. So it's just difficult to actually think that the yellow characters didn't bother to go through the glass no matter how small they are. It's not even hilarious, and the more you think about it, Cheese just caused more destruction more than humorous. You can't expect me to not take an episode seriously while the majority of the episode involves the characters be stuck outside and don't even bother to go around Foster's for an opening window or an unlocked door in order to go through. And remember when I said that Wilt wasn't a contributing factor in this episode? Well, apparently, the other characters can actually go on top of the roof without any of the help from Wilt. If this is literally examples onto why Wilt keeps going to buy stuff into different stores, it doesn't do anything much because it just leads to more and more questions regardless. And let me tell you, just seeing the imaginary friends causing havoc in Foster's is honestly way more difficult to find funny the more you think about it when you watch this episode when you get older. And believe me, I honestly sympathize Frankie at the fact that the imaginary friends are actually doing this instead of just actually doing what's right for the broadcast and the building itself. So anyway, after Mac types in the final code, Cheese is no longer completely in the mood to do any of the stuff that just happened. No destruction, no getting covered in mud. So you would think that after everything that the characters did of typing in the code at the security system, despite at random, or any of the options by going through the windows and stuff, we get this. When Mac was about to hit the enter button, Cheese just comes in at the last minute, damaging the security system. This is honestly one of the prime examples of fan service episode dedicated to characters that have done terribly. Let I remind you that this is the same character who is once the face of Cartoon Network before Adventure Time, Steven Universe, or any of the popular cartoons that came out afterwards. And geez, the technology back then in 2006, by the time this episode aired, if there was social media back then, people would easily discuss of how terrible this episode is. Because let me tell you, Cheese was responsible for nearly everything of what's happening through the majority of this episode. He doesn't care about the privacy of Foster's, and the fact that he doesn't have a motivation onto why he keeps coming back to Foster's because of his disability, and the fact that they're writing his disability terribly when it comes to the fan service for for viewers who actually enjoy Cheese, really damages this character for anyone. Because let me tell you, I can guarantee you that for anyone who talks about Foster's would instantly talk about cheese, but not in episodes like this. Because I can guarantee you that it's just difficult to actually look at the pauses in this episode and overlook the negatives the more you watch this episode when you get older. Believe me, sometimes episodes can be dated regardless of what they usually do when it comes to its plot. And just looking at this episode after so many years and just seeing how stressful it is for the other characters to deal with Cheese stick of completely overreacting and just not responding to anything, this would have been better off if Cheese only made his one and only appearance from Mac Daddy. Because let me tell you, as much as people may despise Cheese in his very first appearance, he still had a better introduction compared to the other episode appearances that he had throughout the series. This episode is honestly no exception to be considered good after what the characters went through, especially the main plot holes that this episode ignores just for the sake of having this a main focus Cheese episode. So after all the stress that Frankie went through in order to get the code out of Cheese, which ends up completely damaging the security system because he got in the way, Frankie instantly snaps and told Cheese that he doesn't belong here and to go home. And little did Frankie know, he said that in front of the broadcast people, which they had no permission to tell the other characters to record anything. All the while Wilt returns. And this just only shows that the damage that the imaginary friends caused from where they live is basically the answer of what the broadcast people can actually think when it comes to the image that completely explains everything. All because of Cheese. And believe it or not, after Frankie's outburst, it just gets a lot more complicated and difficult to enjoy. So the broadcast people completely look through the damages that the imaginary friends have caused all because of Cheese, and they completely say that they live miserable lives at Foster's. Not only that, they completely record Walter, who is completely naked, and when Walter tries to get away from the lens, they just completely they're just completely put the focus on Walter the most, thinking that Frankie is an abusive mother. At this point, people have discussed that Frankie had terrible moments when it comes to one of the babies that she tucked in, saying that, "I hate you, Frankie." And then when we completely see this, how is this humorous? How is this something that we could actually find some hilarious jokes from Frankie? It really doesn't whatsoever. In fact, it really makes you sympathize Frankie even more, because Frankie is mostly Squidward in Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, except that she isn't ruthless like Squidward. She's trying to do something when it comes to making interviews and stuff like that. And then when the broadcast people interview Cheese, they think that Cheese is the happiest imaginary friend who kept his smile even after all this torture. Which I remind you, he was responsible for. Let me tell you that when it comes to an episode that came out in season 5 involving Little Peaswell, Little Peas is trying to go through a journey by trying to fix everything by unlocking the door for the other people to get in order to make this episode a lot more tolerable. It doesn't change anything, because let me tell you, when it comes to that episode, it's just for an apology, just so people can actually watch this episode, but not any of the bad things that happens outside of the building. I honestly don't even know what the writers were thinking by making an episode that takes place inside of the door while everyone is completely outside. I would talk about that episode, but that episode isn't really an episode to be reviewing, since that it just does little to nothing when it comes to the damage that this episode did. So the reason why I mentioned that episode is because the P enters in Frankie's ear and completely tells her how to resolve the whole situation. If that is the reason onto why that episode exists, it doesn't excuse everything. Seriously, one small mistake doesn't always fix everything. And if anything, it just makes this episode a lot more shallow than anything when it comes to the characters that barely appeal much, and then afterwards they don't appeal again. Granted, P is a much more better character than Bendy, but on the other hand, it doesn't excuse much. So anyway, after doing a good interview that actually successfully showed the world that Frankie isn't a terrible mother, which I assume that no one is going to talk about afterwards because it's completely dropped, Frankie buys another security system, and it's a completely different one, and this time she has the code. So she types in the code and then enters inside. All the while, the entire house is completely fixed after the damage that Cheese caused. Cheese caused, not she, just Cheese. And then we get to see that Cheese actually knows the code and ends up going back in. And this just leads to the characters going back to where they started from the beginning. And that's where the episode officially ends. You know, if I ever had this ideal of keeping my promise onto doing Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends Month, and I end up picking 20 episodes, I wouldn't pick this episode because of how terrible it is. Mainly, I want to focus on the good parts of Foster's, but on the other hand, the negatives can easily overweigh the positives. Let me tell you for a fact that this entire episode is a chore. An absolute chore for anyone who actually enjoys the show for what it tries to do when it comes to its creativity. And then when you completely see moments like this involving Cheese, it just doesn't work. Let me tell you that when people discuss the many bad episodes from the show, and when you completely think that there are some good moments that they overlook, that's because those good moments are just difficult to overlook the negatives. Regardless if this is a cartoon or not, episodes like these, despite how popular they were back then, can be easily dated as time has went on. Let me tell you, Adventure Time, Steven Universe, We Bear Bears, and other future cartoons like Infinity Train and maybe Click of the Creek have took some inspirations from older cartoons, and they don't make the same mistake again in order to make terrible episodes. Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends is infamous when it comes to terrible episodes, and this is a prime example of it. Even though if you can say that everyone knows it's Bendy or Imposters or any of the bad episodes I talked about in the past are considered terrible, they were easily talked about. Like, there was so much reasons onto why I didn't review the Europe episode, but the reason why I did it is because people requested me to do it, so I decided, you know what, just for the sake of getting it out of the way, I decided to, here you go, I reviewed the episode, are you happy now? But when it comes to episodes like this, when people don't talk about that much, it's honestly hard to actually think of what the original draft of this episode would have been if it didn't involve Cheese whatsoever. I'm pretty sure that whenever I completely look at these moments, even when I get older and even in the future, this episode will probably get a lot more forgotten and honestly difficult to actually find any kind of likability from it. Believe me, Cheese is the biggest example as to why this episode is terrible. And the fact that this episode is called The Big Cheese just really goes to show that that episode is a fan service episode title. Something you would usually expect from a fanfic, not from an episode. Because when it comes to the world's The Big Cheese, it's usually a big circle cheese. Like in Camp Lazlo, they have an episode with the same title, but it involves with cheese, not a character, actual cheese. So it really makes no sense that this episode is mostly a fan service episode involving a character instead of just a food. So I think that episodes that completely dedicated to a character just by a title is honestly a heads up of what this episode is. Because let me tell you, this episode has, this show has teleport episode title cards when it comes to what they're trying to show, when it comes to 22 minutes of what they're trying to show, involving the characters getting annoyed, getting treated miserably, or getting tortured for the sake of having a character gain a spotlight. They could have done much more better, but instead we end up getting this. Believe me, if there was an episode dedicated to one specific character that is done badly, you would know that that episode should have been much more better executed than what we ended up getting. And let me tell you, this episode is honestly one of the worst offenders. So overall, I really hate this episode. Like, I really do. This episode has aged really badly as time has went on, even after 12 years since that this show came to an end. And if anything, the more bad episodes I look from the show, the more I can actually see onto why people don't want to see me review good episodes from the show. I mean, I am not saying that what you're requesting isn't a bad thing when it comes to reviewing good episodes, but considering of how much views and attention I've been getting when it comes to Cartoon Crisis 1 and 2, I can guarantee you that people are going to expect me to do a third Cartoon Crisis either by the end of this year or soon eventually in the following year. That's just how much they want to see how I can critique teleport episodes from shows like this, all because of one character or a trait or a gag that they keep going on and on but never just catch a break. But all in all, this episode is honestly, it just gave me a realization that this show can't be able to make good things, even though that because the bad things can easily overshadow it. But all in all, once we into Summerpalooza 2, plus Summerpalooza 3, I'm gonna review Destination Imagination, or The World's Around. Imagination Destination, or whatever. Well, it's a Frankie centered plot, and I'm guarantee you that I'm gonna probably focusing on good reviews, reviewing good episodes from this show, instead of reviewing bad episodes. Once I'm done with Pranks for Nothing next month, I'm probably gonna try my best to focusing on the good episodes from this show and focusing on the bad episodes in the future, because at this point, this episode broke me. Unlike other episodes from this show, regardless of what you say otherwise, I'm pretty sure that any of the requests that you have involving me reviewing bad episodes from this show, I'm still getting really irritated at this point, because of how terrible those episodes are by reviewing them. This is why I usually save these episodes for Cartoon Crisis. But then again, you guys are not that patient enough, so who knows? But at the same time, I'm still gonna review good episodes after I'm done with Pranks for Nothing next month. I give this episode a 2 out of 10.
Let's get this